Did Jesus actually do that? Did he actually say that? Have you ever wondered that? I sure did as a non-believer. And there were 4 lines of reasoning that I finally answered the question I can have confidence in what Jesus said and did. The first was the writers of the New Testament wrote as eyewitnesses or recorded eyewitness accounts. The second is this, and I'll explain this in several segments. They appealed to the knowledge of their listeners and readers concerning the truth about Christ. You say, no, wait a minute. What do you mean by that? Okay, now follow me carefully. They not only said, look, we were there. We saw Jesus do that. We were there when he did that. We heard him say that. We were there. We saw him do that. But in the presence, now get this, of hostile, knowledgeable Jewish eyewitnesses. People who knew what Jesus did. They knew what he said. Look, Palestine was just a little piece of dirt. A small parcel of land, and Jerusalem only had a few thousand people even living in it. They knew what Jesus said and what Jesus did. And they would appeal to their knowledge and they say, you were there. You saw him do that. You heard him say that. You were there when he did that. They threw the whole arguments, what Jesus said and did, back on their laps and told them, you know as much as we know of what Jesus said and did. You know, for me historically, that's one of the best tests for truth. Was it presented in the presence of knowledgeable, hostile people, where if it was false, it would have been falsified? Dr. John Warren Montgomery, the legal expert, made this statement. This rule underscores the reliability to testimony to Christ's resurrection, which was presented contemporaneously in the synagogue. In the very teeth of opposition, among hostile cross-examiners who would certainly have destroyed the case for Christianity had the facts been otherwise. In other words, if they had dared to add to or take away from what Jesus said, there'd have been people there immediately who would have corrected them. Dr. Lawrence J. McKinley of St. Peter's College said the value of hostile witnesses in relationship to the recorded events is, first of all, eyewitnesses of the events in question were still alive when the tradition had been completely formed about Christ. And among those eyewitnesses were bitter enemies of this new religious movement, when false statements could and would have been changed. There were knowledgeable people there that would have known if anything had been added to or taken away from what Jesus said or did. One of the best ways to arrive at truth historically about what a person said or did is, was that truth about him presented in the presence of knowledgeable people who would have been exposing it if it was false or anything had been added or taken away? Dr. Robert Grant from the University of Chicago made this observation. At the time the Gospels, were believed to have been written, there were eyewitnesses, and their testimony was not completely disregarded. This means that the Gospels must be regarded as largely reliable witnesses to the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But F.F. Bruce, who was probably, I think I've stated many times, the number one authority in the world on manuscripts until he died just several years ago. And F.F. Bruce made this observation about the eyewitnesses, but those who were hostile. Now, it's a pretty long quote, so don't just read it on the script or hear me say it. Think it through with me. Dr. F.F. Bruce wrote, "And it was not friendly eyewitnesses that the early preachers had to reckon with. There were others less well disposed who were also conversant with the main facts of the ministry and death of Jesus. The disciples could not afford to risk inaccuracy, nor to speak of willful manipulations of the facts, in other words, what Jesus said or did, which would at once be exposed by those who would be only too glad to do so. On the contrary, one of the strong points in the original apostolic preaching is a confident appeal to the knowledge of the hearers. They not only said, "We are witnesses of these things," but also, "As you yourselves know, had there been any tendency to depart from the facts in any material respect, the possible pressure of hostile witnesses in the audience would have served as a further corrective." Men and women, you could not ask for a greater context to grasp truth and note of truth. Was it presented in the presence of hostile people who knew what Jesus said and did, where if they dared to add to or take away, it immediately would have been corrected. You have probably read Acts 2, verse 22. But I wonder, and as many times as you might have read it, if you saw the switch that took place there. Let me show you what I mean. In Acts 2:22, here is Peter speaking to an audience of Jews, and many of them were antagonistic. And notice what Peter said. "Men of Israel, listen to these words. Jesus the Nazarene, a man," now get this, "a man attested to you by God." Do you see? Up until then it was attested to us, we saw, we heard. Now he's thrown it back on their lap and said, "Attested to you and to you and to you by God, with miracles, wonders, and signs, which could be confirmed by the five senses." Now notice what he says. "Which God performed through him in your midst, just as you yourselves know." Look, if they had not seen those miracles, wonders, and signs, Peter had been lucky to make it out there alive, because there were people in that audience that knew exactly what Jesus said and did. And he constantly appealed to their knowledge of it to confirm the truth of what they were teaching. A good illustration of that is found in the book of Acts, chapter 26, verses 24 to 26. Paul is brought before the king, and Paul is making a defense for the resurrection of Christ and the truth of Christianity. And notice how the conversation goes. "And while Paul was saying this in his defense, Festus said in a loud voice, 'Paul, you're out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you mad.' But Paul said, 'I am not out of my mind, most excellent Festus.'" In other words, he was a good politician. "But I utter words of sober truth." That phrase, sober truth, in the Greek means of truth and rationale. And so he said, "I utter words of truth and rationale." Then notice what Paul does. "For the king knows about these matters." See, he's thrown it back in his lap about the truth of what Paul had talked about. "The king knows about these matters, and I speak them also with confidence, since I am persuaded that none of these things have escaped his notice, for this has not been done in a corner." If I cannot trust the writers of the New Testament of what Jesus said and did, then I can't trust anyone, because everything they believed and said about Christ was confirmed by those who were hostile to Christ himself. Did Jesus really do that? Did he really say that? I've had the privilege of writing and traveling and speaking for 50 years. That's 5 decades. And over all the years, I've never had anyone ever answer this question. And the question is this. I said, "Do you believe Jesus said, 'I am the truth'?" Well, everybody say, "Well, of course." I say, "How do you know?" How do you know? He didn't say, "I am a truth," or "I am one of many truths." Not one person has ever answered that in 50 years. I have come to the confidence that Jesus said, "I am the truth," for many reasons, but one is this. If they didn't dare to add to or take away from what Jesus said and did, because there were people there who were knowledgeable about Christ, they knew what he said, they knew what he did, and they were so hostile they would immediately corrected it. That statement, "I am the truth," was so anti-politically correct. It was an affront to Romanism. It was an affront to Judaism. And if he had not said that, it never could have gotten into Scripture. They'd have said, "Wait a minute, when did he ever say that? We were there, he never said that. Show me when he ever said that." That was such an astounding statement. And besides, ask yourself this. Did the apostles go through all the torture and being martyred and killed because they knew Jesus said, I am one of many truths, or I am a truth? No, because I am the truth. You can even go to history, totally apart from the scriptures, and they'll tell you why. Writers will tell you why they died, because Jesus claimed to be the truth. I can trust them that Jesus said, I am the truth, or I am the way, not a way, because they were eyewitnesses. They died for it. And second, it was proclaimed in the presence of knowledgeable people, would have known immediately whether he'd ever said that or not. And it never, ever could have gotten into Scripture. And if it hadn't, they would have lost all credibility. They wrote as eyewitnesses, and they appealed to the knowledge of eyewitnesses concerning the facts and the evidence about the truth of Jesus.